You know, I want you to imagine something for a second. You are plunging 100 feet into just dark, turbulent waters.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, and the pressure against your eardrums is immense. I mean, almost paralyzing. And you have no oxygen tank, right? No diving mask, no wetsuit.
Just you and the ocean.
Exactly. You have only the burning finite reserve of air in your lungs and a heavy, jagged stone tied to your waist, and it's pulling you faster and faster into this sunless abyss. And you are completely surrounded by water that is known to be teeming with sharks.
Yeah, it is a terrifying reality to even try to imagine.
And you're doing all this just to scrape the ocean floor,
Yeah.
the desperate hope of finding a single tiny iridescent sphere buried in the mud.
Right, just for one pearl.
Exactly. Well, welcome to Sleepcast. As our longtime listeners know, our slogan is, proudly, probably the most boring podcast in the world.
But tonight...
Yeah, tonight we are taking you on a journey that might just challenge that title a little bit. You're listening to a special deep dive, tailored specifically for you, the learner.
Because we know exactly how it is out there.
We really do.
Yeah.
The modern world is just a relentless, exhausting barrage of information overload. Ping after ping, headline after headline, and it's all demanding your immediate panic.
It's exhausting. So our mission right now is to help you drift away from that surface noise.
Right. We are going to slowly, gently descend into the deep, sparkling, and sometimes, well, incredibly dark history of the world's most precious gemstones.
Yeah, and it is a genuine pleasure to be here with you tonight to do this. We're going to trace a path from the deep spiritual reverence of gems in ancient India all the way to the massive industrial machinations of the global diamond trade.
It's a huge timeline.
It is. We'll be looking at historical texts on centuries of opulence, the intricate biology and geology of how these stones actually form, and the chronicles of empire building in southern Africa.
Right. Now, I do have to do a quick tone check here because, well, while we're fully embracing our relaxing, softly spoken persona tonight, the actual history of these stones involves, Central Asian warlords, those shark-infested waters we just mentioned, and global empires built on sheer human exertion.
It's pretty intense source material.
It really is. So I promise you a deeply fascinating conversation, even if we do keep our voices hushed and our pacing nice and slow.
Sounds perfect.
So let's begin by traveling back roughly 5,000 years, right into the vast ancient history of India.
Okay, setting the scene.
Yeah. For 5 millennia, jewelry was not just, a pretty accessory to match an outfit. It was the absolute cornerstone of Indian history. We are talking about riches so immense that wars were fought and entire empires were won and lost simply to control the earth that held these stones.
I mean, it is a staggering timeline of wealth. But there is a profound, almost heartbreaking paradox when you look at the archaeological record.
What do you mean?
Well, despite this incredible 5,000-year history of absolute devotion to gems and precious metals, virtually no ancient Indian jewelry survives today in its original form.
Wait, hold on. I have to challenge that right away.
Go for it.
If you walk into any major museum in the world, you will see display cases overflowing with solid gold collars from the Roman Empire, right? Or perfectly intact lapis lazuli amulets from the tombs of ancient Egypt.
True, yeah.
So how is it possible that India, the historical epicenter of global wealth and gemology, managed to lose all of its ancient pieces?
Well, it's because unlike the Egyptians who, buried their jewelry in tombs meant to remain sealed for eternity, the ancient Indian cultures had a completely different philosophical relationship with their wealth.
Okay.
Jewelry was not meant to be frozen in time. It was a living, breathing part of the culture that was continuously reincarnated, in a sense. Each succeeding generation would inherit the jewelry of their ancestors, and instead of preserving it in a vault, they would completely dismantle it.
Wait, really? They would just tear apart a royal heirloom?
Exactly, because the materials themselves, the gold and the gemstones, were considered immortal and pure, but the design, however, was ephemeral.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Right. They would take a heavy gold necklace, throw it into a crucible over a charcoal fire, and melt the pure 24-karat gold down to liquid.
Just melt it right down.
Yep. Then they would extract the most visually striking, powerful gemstones and reset them into an entirely new piece to fit the new era, the new ruler or a new social context. So the gold in the stones survived across thousands of years, but their clothing, their settings were constantly evolving.
That is such a beautiful way to conceptualize it. The stones are these immortal travelers just constantly acquiring new physical forms as they pass from generation to generation.
Exactly.
But I mean, even if the specific ancient settings didn't survive, the sheer volume of wealth pooling in northern India became legendary. And it was a specific, fabled concentration of wealth that literally altered the map of the world. Take Babur, for example, the founder of the Mughal Empire.
Yes, in 1526, Babur was drawn down from the rugged mountains of Central Asia into the Indian subcontinent. And the catalyst for his invasion was, in large part, the overwhelming thirst for this exact opulence.
The lure of the gems.
Absolutely. He founded the magnificent Mughal era, which dominated the region until 1857. And what's crucial to understand here is that when the Mughals established their rule, they didn't just conquer the physical land.
Right.
They inherited and fully adopted this incredibly complex pre-existing Indian relationship with gemstones.
They didn't just lock the wealth in a treasury to back their currency. I mean, they wore it.
Oh, they were lavishly adorned with it. They utilized jewels won in battle, stones received as diplomatic tributes, and gems commissioned from their own vast imperial mines.
Right, but to your point, it wasn't merely a display of purchasing power, was it?
No, not at all. The Mughals and the Indian rulers before them viewed these gems as highly potent religious and metaphysical instruments. The craftsmanship of these intricately designed pieces was a physical method of celebrating the divine.
Which is amazing to think about.
Yeah, you see pieces meticulously crafted to honor Allah, right alongside pieces honoring Hindu deities like Shiva, Krishna, and Vishnu.
And it permeated daily social life too, right? It wasn't just for the emperors and their courts.
Precisely. The stones were the very fabric of social contracts. Elaborate wedding necklaces were mandatory for specific castes. You'd see intricate gold depictions of snakes or fish worn as powerful symbols of fertility.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and heavy nose rings worn as a public, unbreakable testament to happiness and security in a marriage union.
Which brings us to a concept that completely reframes how we look at jewelry today, which is the meaning of color.
This is one of my favorite parts.
Right, because if you or I go to a jeweler today to buy a colored gem, we usually just pick our favorite color. We want a blue one because it matches our eyes, or a red one because it just looks striking.
Right, it's purely aesthetic.
Exactly. But in antiquity, color wasn't an aesthetic choice.
Yeah.
It operated on this elemental color theory that is just beautifully poetic. For instance, red gemstones like rubies were explicitly and physically tied to blood.
Yes. They believed the red color was the literal life force of the animal kingdom trapped in crystalline form.
Trapped in the crystal.
Yeah, red represented power, youthful energy, and vitality. The logic was unbreakable. Without red, without blood, no person or animal survives. Therefore, wearing a red stone was a way of infusing your own body with an abundance of life force.
But the explanation for green is what really caught my attention in the sources. Today we know green is represented by the emerald, and we naturally associate it with nature.
Sure, trees, grass.
Yeah, and the ancients also associated green with the plant life force. But their mechanism for why green represented plant life is astonishing. They believed that green was the literal, physical combination of the blue sky and the yellow sun.
It is a stunning piece of ancient logic.
It really is.
They observed that the blue sky and the yellow sun are what create and sustain plant life on Earth. Therefore, a green emerald wasn't just a rock that happened to look like a leaf. It was the physical manifestation, the solid condensation of that celestial creation. Blue plus yellow equals green. The sky plus the sun equals the earth.
It makes you look at a simple green stone and see the entire atmosphere trapped inside it.
Absolutely.
And because these stones held such massive metaphysical and elemental weight, they were treated with extreme caution. You couldn't just have anyone appraising them.
No, definitely not.
The royal gemologists in these courts were deeply revered figures. The Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, who reigned in the late 17th century, actually had 3 separate, highly specialized gemologists in his royal entourage.
It was an incredible division of labor.
Walk us through that.
Sure. So the first gemologist was solely responsible for the physical care and curation of the gems. The second was the financial mind, responsible for estimating their monetary value and managing the treasury's ledger.
Okay, makes sense.
But the third gemologist had arguably the most vital and difficult job of all, grading the stones and detecting any treatments, enhancements, or outright imitations.
Which makes me wonder, how exactly did they do that? I mean, if you are a modern gemologist, you have Microscopes, chemical solvents, refractometers to measure how light bends through a crystal.
Right, modern tech.
How did a 17th century gemologist detect a fake ruby without any of that technology?
Well, they relied on a profound empirical understanding of the physical properties of minerals. They used specific gravity, for instance.
Okay, density.
Exactly. They knew that a genuine ruby is incredibly dense. So if someone handed them a piece of red glass or a lighter red gemstone like a garnet, they could measure how much water it displaced relative to its weight.
Oh, that's clever.
Yeah, and they also used primitive scratch tests, essentially an early version of the Mohs scale of hardness. A true ruby is a corundum crystal, which is a 9 on the hardness scale, meaning almost nothing except a diamond can scratch it.
So if it gets scrapped.
Right, if the royal gemologist could scratch the red stone with a piece of quartz, he immediately knew it was a fraud.
So these ancient gemologists were essentially high-stakes forensic scientists, operating purely on touch, weight, and visual acuity.
Exactly.
And their field was considered so crucial to the survival and prosperity of the empire that gemological knowledge was actually taught in the Kama Sutra.
Yeah, that always surprises people.
It really does. When we think of the Kama Sutra today, we think of it purely as a manual for physical intimacy. But it was originally a comprehensive guide to essential life arts. And right there, nestled among chapters on poetry and romance, is instruction on how to properly identify a fake ruby.
It really highlights how central authentic gems were to a well-lived, protected life. If a stone was treated or a fake, it wouldn't just be a bad financial investment for the emperor, it would be a spiritual vulnerability.
A weakness in the armor.
Exactly. A fake stone could not channel the divine energy. It was like wearing a shield made of paper into battle.
But speaking of rubies, there is a massive historical irony in how these forensic scientists categorize red stones. You just mentioned the scratch test they used. But for much of India's history, there were two totally different gem minerals that were treated as almost interchangeable, which led to one of the greatest cases of mistaken identity in human history.
Yes. You were referring to the Great Spinel versus ruby confusion.
I am. I look at the British crown jewels, right? The ultimate symbol of imperial power. Sitting right in the center of the imperial state crown is the legendary Black Prince's ruby.
It's iconic.
It's this massive, irregular red stone, roughly 170 carats. It has survived centuries of warfare, fires, assassinations, but modern gemology has revealed that it is not a ruby at all.
No, it is a spinel,
Yeah.
and it shares this mistaken identity with another legendary stone, the massive 352-carat Timur ruby, which is also a spinel.
So how did this happen?
To understand how, you have to look at the geology. Spinel and ruby are completely different minerals chemically. Ruby is aluminum oxide with traces of chromium. Spinel is magnesium aluminum oxide. But, crucially, they form under the exact same geological conditions. They are born in the same metamorphic marble rock formations, meaning they are often mined right next to each other out of the exact same dirt.
And to the naked eye, a high-quality red spinel looks identical to a high-quality ruby.
They are virtually indistinguishable without specialized equipment. The earliest magnificent red gemstones that flooded into the Indian and Mughal treasuries didn't come from modern ruby sources like Myanmar.
Where did they come from?
They were spinels carried over incredibly treacherous, freezing mountain passes from Balakshan, which is a brutal, high-altitude region stretching from today's northern Afghanistan into Tajikistan. Because of their origin, these red spinels were referred to as Balas rubies.
So they just appended the word ruby to the geographic location, and for centuries, kings and emperors fought bloody wars over these stones, fully believing they possessed the ultimate life force of a pure ruby.
Yes. And what is so fascinating about these massive spinels is the physical history etched directly into them. Take the Black Prince's spinel, for example.
Yeah, tell us about that one.
Well, long before it sat in the British crown, it belonged to the Moorish kings of Granada. At some point in its history, it was pierced straight through so it could be worn as a pendant. Centuries later, in an early audacious form of gem enhancement, a jeweler actually plugged that drill hole with a small piece of genuine ruby held in place by a tiny gold setting.
Wait, so the most famous ruby in the world is actually a spinel, with a tiny actual ruby stuffed into a hole to cover up a blemish.
Yes.
That's almost comical.
It is, and the Timur spinel is an even more remarkable historical document. Following a very common royal practice in the Islamic world, the stone is literally inscribed with the names and dates of 6 of its previous imperial owners, carved directly into the surface of the gem in Arabic script.
Wow, just carved right into it.
Yeah, it starts with Shah Jahangir in 1612. The stone isn't just a piece of jewelry, it is a physical, indestructible ledger of its own bloody and opulent journey through human history.
That perfectly sets up our next major concept. We've talked about how these stones were symbols of life and how they recorded history, but they were also utilized as highly functional, literal armor against the universe.
Yes, astrological armor.
Right. If you wanted to fully protect yourself, you didn't just wear a single spinel or emerald. You wore the Navaratna.
The Navaratna, which translates directly from Sanskrit to 9 gemstones. Introduced around the 10th century, this became the ultimate, most mathematically precise talisman for protection and luck in the Hindu religion.
And it was wildly popular.
Oh, it was considered so profoundly effective that the practice was eventually adopted by Islamic rulers in the region as well.
Now, this wasn't just a random assortment of 9 pretty rocks that a jeweler thought looked good together, was it?
Not at all.
It was a very strict, highly specific architectural representation of the celestial bodies in Indian astrology. Let's map out exactly what this looked like, because the physical mechanism of the layout is vital.
The arrangement was absolute law. If you set these 9 gems and piece of jewelry, usually in a circular or square grid pattern, the ruby must always, without exception, be placed in the dead center.
Why the center?
The ruby represents the sun, the gravitational and spiritual center of the solar system.
Okay, so the sun, the ruby, is the anchor. What orbits it?
Surrounding the ruby, you have the moon, which is represented by the pearl. Mercury is the emerald. Mars is represented by red coral. Jupiter is the yellow sapphire, though sometimes a yellow topaz was substituted.
Okay, we're at 5.
Right. Venus is the diamond. Saturn is the blue sapphire. And finally, you have the rising and descending nodes of the moon, which are essentially points where eclipses occur in astrology, and these are represented by the hessonite garnet and the cat's eye chrysoberyl.
It is a stunning concept. You are taking a miniature cosmos forged in the dirt and the sea and arranging it perfectly. But how did the ancient Indians believe this actually worked? What was the mechanism that transferred planetary power into the body of the person wearing it?
The underlying philosophy relied on the concept of flawless crystalline structure acting as a conduit. According to ancient texts like S.M. Tagore's Manimala, all of these gems must be highborn and flawless.
Highborn and flawless.
Yes. Think of a flawless gemstone as a perfectly clear window. When a specific planet's light and cosmic energy hits the Earth, the corresponding flawless gem catches that energy and funnels it purely and safely into the wearer's body. It acts as an unbroken conduit.
But what if the stone isn't flawless? What if there's a massive crack or a cloud inside the crystal?
Then the energy scatters. It becomes corrupted. A flawed stone was believed to not only fail to protect you, but it could actually attract negative, chaotic energy and invite illness or disaster.
It makes me think of modern fiber optic cables.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Yeah, because if you have a perfectly extruded glass fiber, light can travel miles through it in an instant, carrying massive amounts of data. But if there is a crimp or a flaw or a break in that glass cable, the signal degrades, it corrupts, and the data is lost. The ancient Indians were essentially creating a customized wearable fiber optic circuit board for the human soul. You strap the solar system to your chest to hack your own destiny.
And just like any powerful technology, there were massive risks involved. You couldn't just throw on a Navaratna without deeply understanding the astrological weather, so to speak.
Right.
There was an intense, palpable fear surrounding one specific stone in this arrangement, the blue sapphire, representing the planet Saturn.
Why Saturn? What made the blue sapphire so terrifying?
Well, in ancient Hindu astrology, Saturn was viewed as a dark, slow-moving, and incredibly turbulent planet. It was associated with harsh karma, severe obstacles, delays, and profound life lessons.
Sounds heavy.
It was. Its energy was considered incredibly powerful but highly volatile. The belief was that if a blue sapphire wasn't absolutely mathematically flawless, or if the wearer's astrological chart clashed with Saturn's current position, the stone wouldn't just fail to protect you, it could actively destroy you.
Wow.
Yeah, it could bring immediate financial ruin, madness, or death to the wearer.
It was essentially a radioactive element in the jewelry. You have to handle it perfectly or it poisons you.
Exactly. The fear was so intense and pervasive that many people simply chose to avoid the blue sapphire altogether. They would commission a Navaratna piece, but intentionally leave Saturn's slot empty, preferring an incomplete shield over the risk of triggering Saturn's wrath.
Better a missing piece of armor than a poisoned one. But on the exact opposite end of the spectrum, there was a desperate, insatiable desire for the stone representing Jupiter.
Yes, the yellow sapphire. Unlike Saturn's volatile, punitive energy, Jupiter was the planet of pure benevolence.
The bringer of good things.
Exactly. Jupiter promised straightforward, unadulterated wealth, high intelligence, and robust physical health. Everyone wanted a flawless yellow sapphire.
But the Earth rarely produces a perfectly flawless crystal. So if your spiritual and financial health depends on a flawless yellow sapphire, what do you do when nature gives you a cloudy one?
You intervene. This desperate need for flawless stones led to some of the earliest forms of complex gem treatment. As far back as the 16th century, gem dealers understood a primitive form of thermal enhancement.
Okay.
They would take a cloudy yellow sapphire, a stone that was perhaps filled with microscopic silk-like inclusions that blocked the light, and they would pack it tightly inside a ball of wet clay.
So they seal it in a clay crucible. Then what?
They would bury that clay ball deep inside a charcoal fire using hand bellows to pump oxygen into the coals, raising the temperature to over 1,000 degrees Celsius.
That is incredibly hot.
They would bake the stone for hours. The intense heat would actually melt those microscopic internal inclusions, effectively dissolving them into the crystal matrix. When they cracked the clay open after it cooled, a stone that when in cloudy would emerge beautifully transparent and eye-clean.
It is sheer human ingenuity. They figured out how to artificially finish the geological process that the Earth started, just to ensure their connection to Jupiter was crystal clear.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable.
Now, at the time the Navaratna was formalized around the 10th century, practically all of these gem materials could be found either on or near the Indian subcontinent. The Earth willingly yielded these cosmic crystals.
For the most part, yes.
But while you can take a pickaxe and dig a ruby or a sapphire out of the dirt, the jewel representing the moon required a profoundly different and much more terrifying method of harvest.
We are talking about the pearl.
Yeah. This is where our story shifts drastically, from the meticulous, quiet laboratories of the royal gemologists straight into the abyss. We have to examine what it actually took to procure those flawless, round, white pearls that represented the moon.
Well, for centuries, the global demand for the finest natural pearls was supplied by two primary locations: the Arabian Gulf, specifically trading through Basra in modern-day Iraq, and the Gulf of Mannar, which lies in the Laccadive Sea between the southeastern tip of India and the west coast of Sri Lanka.
I want to focus on the actual physical mechanics of this labor because the details are chilling. Imagine the life of a pearl fisher in the 1600s.
It's hard to fathom.
You wake up before dawn. You head out onto the open ocean in a small, fragile wooden boat. You get out past the reefs and you prepare for the dive. And remember, there are no oxygen tanks.
All right.
There are no modern diving fins or glass masks to help you see underwater.
You are operating entirely on your own physiological limits.
You took a heavy stone, usually granite, attached to a rope, and you tie it to your foot or your waist. You take a deep breath and you roll over the edge of the boat.
And down you go.
The weight of the stone pulls you down at terrifying speed. You plunge 50, 80, over 100 feet down into the dark. The water pressure is crushing your chest. You are completely blind in the murky water, and you are surrounded by an environment known to be heavily infested with sharks.
And once you hit the bottom, the clock is ticking against your brain's demand for oxygen.
You have perhaps 60 seconds. You frantically scrape the seabed, feeling for the rough shells of oysters, stuffing whatever you can find into a woven net tied around your neck.
Panic-induced.
Your lungs are burning, screaming for air. You release the heavy stone, you pull the ascent rope, and you rise to the surface as fast as humanly possible, breaking the water and gasping for life.
And that agonizing, oxygen-starved process was just a single dive.
A single dive.
Historical accounts from the region detail that these men would repeat this brutal cycle 40, 50, up to 60 times in a single day.
60 times a day, dropping 100 feet into the crushing dark, holding your breath until you nearly black out, constantly looking over your shoulder for predators. I mean, that's just torturous.
It was a brutal existence.
And the absolute heartbreak of it all is the biological reality of natural pearls. You would do all of this, risk your life 60 times a day, hoping that maybe, just maybe, 1 out of 1,000 oysters in your net would contain a pearl.
Because the biological mechanism of natural pearl is incredibly rare. Today, people often think a pearl is formed when a grain of sand gets inside an oyster.
Right, that's what I was taught.
But that's largely a myth. In the wild, a natural pearl is usually triggered by a parasite, like a marine worm that bores through the oyster's shell to attack the soft body inside.
It's an immune response.
Exactly. To protect itself from the invading parasite, the oyster's mantle tissue secretes a substance called nacre, which is a composite of a crystalline mineral called aragonite and a binding protein called conchiolin.
Okay, so it coats the invader.
It wraps the parasite in thousands of microscopic concentric layers of this nacre, isolating the threat. Over years, this forms a pearl. But the vast majority of oysters never encounter a parasite in this way. So a pearl fisher could haul up thousands of oysters and find absolutely nothing but meat and empty shells.
So why do it? Why would human beings subject themselves to this level of torturous, low-yield labor?
Because the economic and spiritual demand from the ruling classes was completely insatiable. For the Mughals, the Maharajas, and later the European monarchs, pearls were fundamental.
They needed them.
Oh yeah, they weren't just strung on necklaces. They were sewn onto imperial clothing in massive, heavy quantities. They were used to embellish religious statues and thrones. But they couldn't just use any irregular pearl. Only the finest, whitest, perfectly spherical natural pearls with the highest orient, that deep, iridescent shimmer, were acceptable.
Because beyond just looking beautiful, they believed these specific pearls brought optimal good fortune. Long life, untold riches, and uniquely, our sources mention a very specific psychological mechanism they believed fine pearls brought the literal forgiveness of sins.
Which is an incredibly powerful psychological motivator. Imagine you are an emperor.
Right.
You have likely conquered territories, ordered executions, and shed immense amounts of blood to secure and hold your throne. You are carrying a heavy karmic burden. The promise of spiritual absolution, neatly wrapped in a beautiful, tiny, pure white sphere brought up from the bottom of the ocean, is priceless.
You can literally wear your absolution on your chest.
The desire for these natural pearls was so intense, so relentless, that the environmental impact was catastrophic. By the 1600s, this relentless daily diving by thousands of pearl fishers had completely decimated the oyster beds in the Gulf of Mannar.
Wow.
They didn't just harvest pearls, they entirely collapsed the local ecosystem. They simply overfished the region into oblivion.
They scraped the bottom of the ocean clean, and when the Gulf of Mannar was depleted, the global trade turned its eye to the New World, specifically off the coast of Venezuela, to help satisfy this bottomless appetite for the organic gem. But eventually, those banks and the historic banks of the Arabian Gulf were also largely depleted.
It gives us a profound appreciation for what a natural pearl actually is. Today, if you walk into a jewelry store, almost 99% of the pearls you see are cultured pearls.
Right, which was a 20th century invention.
Yes, pioneered by figures like Kokichi Mikimoto in Japan. With a cultured pearl, a human technician physically inserts a surgical irritant, usually a tiny bead made of shell, directly into the oyster's reproductive organ in a safe, controlled, shallow water farm environment.
Very different from free diving in the ocean.
Exactly. The oyster coats the bead in nacre, and a few years later you harvest a guaranteed round pearl, but a truly natural, historical pearl. It is a miracle of biological probability, born in the dangerous depths, and brought to the surface by the sheer, desperate lung capacity of a diver who risked his life 60 times a day.
The blood and breath spent for a natural pearl is staggering. It completely reframes the object. You look at an antique pearl necklace, and you don't just see a gem. You feel a sense of awe, and honestly, a little bit of dread.
Yeah, it's a heavy history.
But if the pearls representing the moon were this dangerous and arduous to harvest, how did they procure the diamonds representing Venus? Did the Earth yield those easily, or was there an equally brutal human cost? Let's transition from the terrifying depths of the sea back onto solid land, and not just any land. We need to talk about the legendary Golconda Fortress.
Golconda. For antiquity, the most important diamond mines in the world were located near the fortress city of Golconda in the modern-day Indian state of Telangana. The exact geographic locations of these mines were such a closely guarded state secret that revealing them to an outsider promised a horrible, agonizing death.
Golconda wasn't just a mine. It was the absolute epicenter of the global diamond trade. The scale of the commerce there is hard to wrap your head around. At its peak, you would see trading caravans leaving the gates of Golconda to travel across Asia that were comprised of up to 10,000 camels and oxen.
10,000 animals in a single convoy.
Just a moving, breathing city of animals carrying rough diamonds out and bringing emeralds, rubies, sapphires, and pearls from all corners of the earth back in. Now, the geological mechanism of these Indian diamonds is important. They weren't digging deep vertical shafts into the earth like we do today. These were alluvial deposits.
Correct. Millions of years ago, volcanic pipes brought the diamonds to the surface, but over millennia, rain and rivers eroded those pipes, washing the diamonds downstream.
Right, the water moves them.
The diamonds settled into the riverbeds and the gravel of the floodplains. So, the mining process largely involved thousands of laborers systematically digging up massive amounts of river gravel, washing it, and hand sorting it under the blistering sun to find the rough diamond crystals.
Oh, once they found them, what did they do with them? When you or I think of a diamond today, we immediately picture a brilliant, sparkling, multifaceted round stone on a modern engagement ring. We think of light flashing everywhere. But the ancient Indian diamonds looked completely different.
Because their aesthetic goals were entirely different. According to the Indian life science of Ayurveda, wearing a diamond guaranteed long life, incredible physical endurance, and beauty. But the power was in the stone's integrity, its mass.
They didn't want to cut it away.
No, they didn't want to grind away half the diamond just to make it sparkle.
Right. The historical texts detail that Indian diamonds were typically worn as thin, flat slices. A diamond crystal has natural directions of weakness called cleavage planes. The Indian artisans would strike the rough crystal perfectly along these planes to cleave off large, flat plates of diamond.
Just slicing it.
Yeah, they might polish a few flat facets around the edges to smooth it out, but essentially they were wearing flat, glowing plates of crystal.
The evolution of how we cut diamonds, how we get from those flat Indian slices to the modern fiery sparklers we see today, is a fascinating journey, driven almost entirely by raw economics and industrial technology.
How so?
To understand that shift, we have to trace the diamond's path out of India into 19th century Europe, specifically to places like Koster's Cutting House in Amsterdam, which during the mid-1800s was arguably the largest and most famous diamond cutting establishment in the world.
The way these cutting houses operated back then is so telling. It wasn't about the artistry of making the most beautiful stone possible. It was a brutal, penny-pinching economic calculus. In these early factories, diamond cutting was painfully slow, manual labor.
And costly.
Yeah, and the cutters were financially penalized by the factory owners if they took too long on a stone, or worse, if they removed too much material from the original rough crystal.
Exactly. The cutters were paid largely based on weight retention. If a cutter started with a 2-carat rough crystal and cut it down to a beautiful 1-carat diamond, he was losing money because he wasted 50% of the material.
So they didn't want to lose the weight.
Therefore, the typical cut that emerged from this era is what the modern jewelry industry calls the old mine cut.
If you, the listener, want a visual for this, go find a picture of an antique Victorian engagement ring, maybe something your great-grandmother wore. You might notice that the diamond doesn't look flat and perfectly round like a modern stone. It looks a bit chunky, a bit deep, almost like a softly rounded square or a cushion. This is exactly why.
The geometry of the rough dictated the final shape. Many rough diamond crystals are octahedral, meaning they look like 2 4-sided pyramids attached base to base.
Okay, picture that.
Because the cutter was terrified of wasting weight, he wouldn't try to grind that square pyramid into a perfect circle. He would just gently lop off the very top point to create the table and the very bottom point to create the cullet and polish the sides. The resulting old mine cut stone was very deep, with a small top facet and a large, chunky body.
It was entirely a volume business. It's exactly like a butcher who is terrified of trimming too much fat off a steak because the boss is going to dock his pay for every ounce of meat he throws on the track.
Great analogy.
The cutters were actively trapping the light inside a dark, heavy stone just to keep the carat weight on the scale.
But then human engineering intervened. At the turn of the 20th century, 2 major technological leaps completely changed the physical mechanics of diamond cutting, and by extension, changed the entire aesthetic of the global diamond trade.
The first was the bruting machine, invented around the 1870s.
Yes. Bruting is the process of making the outline of a diamond round. Before the machine, a cutter had to take 2 diamonds, mount them on sticks, and manually grind them against each other by hand for days to slowly wear down the corners.
That sounds exhausting.
The brooding machine automated this. It acted like a lathe. You mount one diamond in the spinning chuck of the machine, and as it spins at high speed, you press another diamond against it. It perfectly and quickly grinds the spinning stone into a perfect symmetrical circle.
But the real game changer, the invention that fundamentally altered diamond economics, arrived around 1900, the circular diamond saw.
The saw was revolutionary. Before the saw, if you had that octahedral pyramid crystal, your only option was to grind the top half away into dust to create a flat surface. You were literally turning precious diamond into worthless powder.
Just grinding it away.
But the circular saw, which was a paper-thin disc of phosphor bronze, charged along the edge with diamond dust and olive oil, spinning at incredibly high RPMs, allowed a cutter to physically slice that hard crystal cleanly in two.
So now, instead of grinding away the top half of the pyramid and losing it forever, you slice the top half off, and you yield two separate sellable diamonds from a single piece of rough.
Right.
You have virtually no waste.
Precisely. By 1902, the entire industry woke up to a new mathematical reality. Because the circular saw saved so much weight by yielding two stones instead of one, the cutters no longer had to fear trimming the fat off the stone. They could afford to lose a little extra material to optimize the angles for light reflection.
That single technological leap, a spinning bronze blade, shifted the entire global culture of diamonds. It shifted the cultural emphasis away from prioritizing sheer, heavy carat weight and shifted it entirely towards prioritizing beauty, mathematical proportion, and that brilliant, fiery sparkle we consider the standard today. It's a perfect example of how the industrial tools we invent end up dictating our very definition of beauty.
It is a profound shift, but even as these cutting techniques were being revolutionized in the factories of Amsterdam and Antwerp, a massive existential crisis was looming back at the source.
Oh, right, India.
By the mid-19th century, the legendary Indian mines of Golconda, which had supplied the world for millennia, were largely exhausted.
The numbers are staggering. It's estimated that Indian miners pulled at least 12 million carats of diamonds out of the riverbeds over 2,000 years. 12 million carats.
Incredible volume.
But eventually, no matter how rich the earth is, it runs dry. The global appetite for diamonds, especially now that they could be cut so beautifully in Europe, was only growing, and the primary ancient source was completely empty.
The global market desperately needed a new source. It needed a geological miracle, which brings us to the year 1867 and a small, dusty farming region in southern Africa called Hopetown.
We are leaving the riverbeds of India and the factories of Europe, and we are traveling to the arid plains near the Orange River in Griqualand, South Africa. The story of how the epicenter of global wealth shifted continents is almost cinematic.
It really is.
In 1867, a young boy named Erasmus Jacobs is playing on his family's farm. He's playing with a collection of ordinary river stones, using them casually as marbles. One of his marbles is a pretty, milky white rock that catches the light.
A neighbor notices the strange weight and luster of this marble. It gets passed along, examined by various individuals, and eventually sent to an expert mineralogist in Grahamstown. He tests it and confirms the impossible. This child's marble was a massive 21-carat rough diamond.
The colonial secretary to the Cape government, a man named Richard Salvey, famously held that rough stone in his hand during a parliamentary session and declared, "Gentlemen, this is the rock on which the future success of South Africa will be built."
And his prediction was terrifyingly accurate. In 1870, just a few years later, an even larger deposit of diamonds was found on a farm owned by two brothers, Johannes Nicholas and Diederik Arnoldus de Beer.
The De Beer brothers.
Yes. This discovery was different from India. These weren't alluvial riverbed diamonds washed down from mountains. These were kimberlite pipes.
Let's explain the physical mechanism of a kimberlite pipe, because it dictates everything that happens next.
A kimberlite pipe is essentially an ancient, extinct volcanic carrot. Millions of years ago, a supersonic eruption of magma blasted up from deep within the Earth's mantle, bringing diamonds up with it and solidifying into a vertical pipe-like structure in the Earth's crust.
Right.
It means the diamonds aren't spread out over miles of riverbed. They are concentrated deep within a very specific vertical column of blue rock.
So to get them, you can't just wash gravel. You have to dig a very deep, very dangerous hole.
Yeah.
And when word got out about the De Beer brothers' farm, it triggered a massive, unprecedented influx of prospectors from all over the globe.
It was an absolute frenzy. You had hardened, desperate prospectors arriving from the exhausted gold rushes of Australia and California. You had British entrepreneurs, starry-eyed dreamers, and outright criminals, all descending on this one specific patch of dirt.
Just digging anywhere they could.
They began frantically digging at a site that would become known as Kimberley, creating what is famously referred to as the Big Hole.
It became the largest hand-dug excavation in human history. To give you a visceral sense of the scale and the chaos of this moment, we can look at the writings of the British author Anthony Trollope, who visited Kimberley in 1877.
What did he say?
He stood at the edge of this vast, widening crater and observed thousands of miners at work in the blistering heat. He wrote, "You look down and see the swarm of black ants busy at every hole and corner, with their picks moving and shoveling the loose blue soil."
A swarm of black ants. It's such a chilling, dehumanizing, and purely industrial way to view human labor.
It perfectly encapsulates the paradigm shift that was happening. We've gone from the royal artisans in the mold courts, carefully cleaving protective talismans while reciting prayers, to this massive, dirty, open-pit industrial scramble for pure cash.
But very quickly, this chaotic free-for-all was brought to heel by the brute, calculated force of monopoly capitalism. And this is where we see the rise of Cecil John Rhodes.
Rhodes is a figure who casts a massive, dark shadow over the entire African continent. He arrived in Kimberley in 1871 as a young man. At that time, the Kimberley Big Hole was divided into 3,588 tiny individual claims, each roughly 30 feet square, being worked by different independent miners.
But physics and geology eventually forced a crisis. As these independent miners dug their 30-foot squares deeper and deeper into the earth, two things happened. First, the structural integrity of the walls failed, causing massive deadly collapses. Second, they hit the water table.
Oh, right.
The deep pits began to violently flood with groundwater.
And a guy with a bucket and a rope can't fight an underground aquifer. You need massive steam-powered pumping machinery to keep the water out of a deep mine.
Exactly. The individual miners simply couldn't afford the exorbitant capital costs of importing heavy steam machinery from Europe. They were drowning, financially and literally.
But Cecil Rhodes had secured financing. He shrewdly recognized that in a deep earth mining operation, you don't necessarily need to own the diamonds to control the mine, you just need to own the water pumps.
He cornered the market for the pumping machinery. He then leveraged that mechanical dominance and the massive capital he raised to systematically buy out his drowning competitors. Over several years, he consolidated those 3,588 independent claims into just 71 larger operations, and eventually he merged them all to create De Beers Consolidated Mines Limited.
By 1890, through sheer ruthless capital dominance, Rhodes and De Beers had cornered roughly 90% of the entire global diamond market. South Africa was now, by a massive margin, the world's largest producer of diamonds.
It is an astounding concentration of wealth. The human lust for the stone remained exactly the same as it was in the days of Babur and the Mughals, but the methodology had completely mutated. It was no longer about divine right or astrological protection. It was about the mechanics of ruthless global industrial capitalism.
And with that absolute monopoly, Rhodes could do two very specific things. First, he could artificially constrain the global output of diamonds, locking them in vaults to artificially keep consumer prices sky high. And second, because he was the only employer in town, he could ruthlessly drive down the costs of labor at the mine to maximize his profit margins.
Which leads us directly into the profound and tragic socioeconomic consequences of this era. It is absolutely vital that we impartially examine the mechanics of what the historical record shows here, because the reverberations of this mining boom structurally shaped the entire 20th century in Africa.
So what did that look like?
Well, the discovery of diamonds in Kimberley, followed shortly by the discovery of massive gold deposits in the Witwatersrand region in 1886, caused a violent economic revolution.
The sheer physical infrastructure explosion alone is staggering. The records show that in 1860, the entire region had a mere 3 kilometers of railway line. By 1889, driven entirely by the logistical need to service these deep earth mines and transport heavy machinery, there were 3,300 kilometers of railway stretching across the landscape.
It's just a massive overnight expansion.
And entire forests were severely decimated, completely clear-cut by the mining conglomerates to provide the massive, continuous amounts of wood fuel required to run the steam engines and the water pumps.
But the environmental cost paled in comparison to the human cost. To maximize profit, the De Beers monopoly needed a permanent, utterly controllable supply of cheap manual labor. The historian R. Reed notes that this desperate corporate need for cheap labor literally shaped the social and economic policy in South Africa for the next century.
How exactly did they physically control the labor force? What was the mechanism on the ground?
It started with architecture. In Kimberley, under the public guise of preventing workers from swallowing or stealing rough diamonds, the company created strict living compounds.
Like dorms.
These weren't just dormitories. They were closed, prison-like compounds completely surrounded by high-wire mesh and corrugated iron. Once a worker signed a contract, they were locked inside this wire mesh compound for the duration of their employment. They could only buy food and supplies from the company-owned stores inside the mesh at prices dictated by the company.
And crucially, the historical record states this architectural restriction only applied to the black African workers. White miners, who largely managed the operations, were completely free to live in town with their families and come and go as they pleased.
That was the first physical architectural step towards systemic segregation in the region. But as the 20th century dawned, this system quickly evolved from corporate company policy into brutal national legislation.
Becoming law.
Laws were enacted by the colonial government to cement this racial labor dynamic permanently. The first major piece of this puzzle was the Mines and Works Act of 1911.
Let's break down how that law actually functioned based on our sources. It explicitly excluded black Africans from certain skilled mining jobs?
Yeah.
But how? Did the law just flat out state you cannot hold a skilled job based on your race?
It operated through the mechanism of licensing. The law stipulated that to perform skilled, higher-paying, and safer jobs like operating the heavy steam machinery, running the complex hoists, or handling the dynamite for blasting, you had to possess a specific government certificate of competency. And the law legally restricted the government from issuing those certificates to black workers?
So they created a bureaucratic ceiling.
Exactly. It legally reserved the lucrative, skilled labor for white workers, while black workers were legally relegated forever to the most dangerous, lowest-paying, back-breaking manual labor deep in the mines.
But the mining conglomerates still faced a problem. How do you guarantee a constant stream of black men willing to leave their homes to work in these dangerous wire mesh compounds?
Right. If they don't want to work in a dangerous mine for low pay, why wouldn't they just stay home and farm their land?
Because the government took the land. This leads to the Natives Land Act of 1913, which our sources highlight as arguably the most devastating piece of legislation to the social fabric of the continent.
Explain the mechanics of the 1913 Act. How did it function on paper, and what did it do in reality?
On paper, the Natives Land Act systematically stripped black Africans, who constituted roughly 80% of the population, of their legal right to own, buy, or even rent land anywhere outside of incredibly small, heavily degraded designated reserves. These reserves made up roughly 7% of the total landmass of the country.
So they squeezed 80% of the population onto 7% of the worst, least arable land.
Yes. And the mechanism was chillingly effective. By removing their ability to own enough land to be self-sufficient farmers, the colonial government destroyed traditional agricultural independence. If you cannot grow enough food to feed your family, and the colonial government is suddenly demanding that you pay a hut tax or a poll tax exclusively in cash, you have only one option.
You are economically forced to migrate to the diamond and gold mines to seek wage labor just to survive and pay the taxes.
Precisely. It was a perfectly engineered legislative labor funnel. It destroyed independent agricultural self-sufficiency solely to feed the insatiable, cheap labor demands of the mining corporations.
I have to just stop for a moment and point out the tragic, profound irony of this entire historical journey we've taken tonight.
What's that?
We started this deep dive in ancient India, looking at these precious gems as literal metaphysical shields against bad fortune. They were the Navaratna, the 9 stones perfectly arranged on your chest, specifically meant to bring health, wisdom, and physically protect you from the dark, chaotic forces of the universe.
Right.
But here in southern Africa, the pursuit of those exact same protective stones became the literal engine for a century of systemic oppression, wire mesh compounds, and brutal racial segregation. The spiritual shield became an industrial weapon.
That is a very profound way to contextualize it. The chemistry of the stones themselves didn't change, but the scale of human ambitions surrounding them mutated to a massive imperial level. And the staggering wealth generated by these diamond and gold mines directly provoked massive British imperial expansion.
Because once the British government realized the sheer world-altering scale of the wealth buried in the South African crust, they realized they couldn't just let independent Boer republics or African kingdoms control it.
Exactly. The British Empire recognized that to protect and extract this wealth, they needed total, undisputed geopolitical control of the entire region. This desperate desire to secure the diamond and gold fields led directly to the military mobilization and defeat of the independent Zulu kingdom in 1879, and to the bitter, scorched earth Boer Wars fought against the Dutch-descended settlers at the turn of the century.
They were quite literally redrawing the map of an entire continent, burning farms and fighting wars for the sake of the shiny rocks buried in the ground.
Ultimately, the British colonial dream was violently realized with the creation of the Union of South Africa in 1910. This act united the various squabbling colonies and conquered territories under one single flag, largely to create a unified, easily controllable jurisdiction to protect and streamline the mining economy.
And if you want a physical, ultimate manifestation of this era of imperial conquest, you only have to look at one stone, the Cullinan diamond.
Oh, the Cullinan. Discovered in 1905 right near Pretoria.
It remains, to this day, the largest gem-quality rough diamond ever found in the history of the Earth. In its rough, unpolished form, it weighed over 3,000 carats.
3,000 carats.
It was roughly the size of a human heart.
And what happened to it? It didn't stay in South Africa.
No, it was purchased by the colonial government of the Transvaal and presented as a grand gift to King Edward VII of the United Kingdom. It was subsequently shipped to Europe and painstakingly cut into several massive, flawless stones.
And they are famous.
Yes. The largest resulting gem, the 530-carat Cullinan, often known as the Great Star of Africa, is now permanently set in the head of the sovereign scepter with cross, part of the British crown jewels. The second largest, Cullinan II, is set squarely in the front band of the imperial state crown, the very crown used at coronations in the Tower of London.
The ultimate sparkling spoils of a transformed and scarred continent, sitting quietly behind a pane of bulletproof glass in London. It is an immense, heavy history to take in, isn't it? As we draw this deep dive to a gentle close, I want to sincerely thank you, the listener, for staying with us on this long, winding journey.
We covered a lot of ground today.
We did. We've traveled from the quiet, metaphysical reverence of the Mughal gemologists peering at spinels down into the terrifying, breathless depths of the Arabian Gulf with the pearl fishers. We've watched diamond cutters in Amsterdam reshape the very definition of beauty with spinning bronze saws. And we've stared down into the massive, echoing, human-made craters of South Africa.
We have attempted to trace the vast bedrock of human history, economics, and spirituality, all through the focused lens of a few small, glittering crystals pulled from the dirt.
As you drift toward sleep tonight, letting the weight of the day finally fall away, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. When you hold a gemstone in your hand, whether it's an heirloom ring passed down from your grandmother or a simple pendant, you are holding a massive historical paradox.
Very true.
On one hand, it is a piece of ancient, compressed starlight. It is a miracle of deep earth geology and biology that humanity once truly believed had the power to represent the divine forces of the universe, to physically hold the blue sky and the yellow sun in the palm of your hand.
Yet, simultaneously, that same tiny, silent stone possesses enough gravity to alter the borders of nations, to fell ancient empires, and to dictate the legislative freedom of millions of people.
So the question remains, the next time you touch a diamond, or a ruby, or a pearl, which energy are you really feeling? Are you feeling the protective warmth of the cosmos, or the heavy, inescapable gravity of human ambition? Thank you again for listening. Take a deep, slow breath, let the history wash over you, and rest easy. A brand new, deeply relaxing episode of Sleepcast will be waiting for you tomorrow, as we release new episodes every single day. Good night.